Judge Harold Montgomery's alarm buzzed at precisely 5:45 a.m. Just like it had for the past 25 years. He reached over and turned it off with the practiced motion of someone who thrived on routine. The early morning sunlight was just beginning to peek through the heavy curtains of his Boston townhouse, casting long shadows across the room. At 58 years old, Judge Montgomery took pride in maintaining the strict schedule he had followed since his appointment to the Suffolk County Courthouse. His wife, Eleanor, was already downstairs preparing his breakfast: 2 slices of bacon, scrambled eggs, and a cup of strong black coffee. The smell wafted up to the second floor as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his gray hair meticulously combed. "Morning, love," Eleanor called out as he descended the stairs, his black robe draped over his arm. She was a petite woman with silver hair and a kind smile that had seen him through decades of courtroom battles. "Good morning, Eleanor," Montgomery replied, settling into his chair at the breakfast table. He unfolded the Boston Globe, scanning the headlines while taking small sips of his coffee. "Anything exciting on the docket today?" "Just the usual," Montgomery replied, his eyes skimming over the words. "Traffic court in the morning, minor infractions in the afternoon. It's going to be another routine day." As he drove his vintage Cadillac to the courthouse, Montgomery noticed the city coming to life. Construction workers began their day, shop owners lifted their shutters, and students waited at bus stops. The diversity of faces he passed barely registered with him. He had grown accustomed to his insulated world of legal procedures and courthouse politics. When he arrived at the courthouse at 7:30 a.m., the parking lot was nearly empty. Just as he liked it, Montgomery nodded to the security guard, Sam, who had been working the morning shift for as long as he could remember. "Morning, Judge," Sam said with a friendly wave, not bothering to check his ID badge anymore. In his chambers, his clerk, Rachel, had already arranged the day's files in neat stacks on his desk. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, handing him his schedule. "We have 42 cases in traffic court this morning, the first one at 8 a.m. sharp." Montgomery skimmed through the files quickly. Most were speeding tickets, parking violations, and running red lights. He had seen thousands of these cases over the years and had developed a system. Young people usually got stern warnings, middle-aged folks received standard fines, and he tended to be more lenient with elderly defendants who seemed confused by traffic rules. What Montgomery never admitted to himself was how his quick judgments often carried unconscious biases. He didn't notice how his stern warnings were more frequently given to young defendants, while similar cases involving minorities usually resulted in fines. In his mind, he was simply being efficient, making snap decisions based on his decades of experience. Judge Harold Montgomery straightened his robe and prepared to enter the courtroom. It was now 7:55 a.m., and the morning docket was about to commence. He could hear the murmur of voices through the door, defendants, lawyers, and court officers all preparing for another day of legal proceedings. Rachel handed him his gavel, and he took a moment to straighten the family photos on his desk, a routine that gave him a sense of stability before facing the day's cases. At exactly 8 a.m., Judge Montgomery's voice boomed through the courtroom as he entered. The familiar words washed over him as he took his seat at the bench. Looking out over the gathered crowd, the faces before him were diverse, young and old, from different races and backgrounds, but Montgomery saw them all the same way: cases to be processed, decisions to be made, justice to be served. The first few cases proceeded as usual: speeding tickets, parking violations, running red lights. Montgomery moved through them quickly, rarely letting defendants ramble on with excuses. By 9:30 a.m., he had already processed 15 cases, most ending with guilty pleas and standard fines. The judge prided himself on running an efficient courtroom. His colleagues often joked that you could set your watch by his proceedings. Case number 2305, Rachel Anderson, the bailiff called out. A well-dressed woman in her early 40s stood up from the back row and walked to the front of the courtroom. She wore a navy blue suit and carried a leather briefcase. Her blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun. She had an air of quiet confidence, which caught Montgomery's attention. "Miss Anderson," Judge Montgomery began, glancing down at the file in front of him. "You're here contesting a parking violation from February 12th. The fine is $200. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Rachel replied, her voice steady. "I have documentation that proves I had permission to park in that space." Montgomery sighed heavily, making no attempt to hide his irritation. Another person trying to waste the court's time with excuses. He thought to himself, he had seen it all before, or so he believed. "Miss Anderson, The officer's report clearly states that your vehicle was parked in a restricted zone outside the downtown office building for over 2 hours, he said, his tone becoming increasingly condescending. These spaces are reserved for official business only. Rachel opened her briefcase and removed several papers. Yes, Your Honor, if I may explain. The sign clearly states the parking restrictions. Montgomery interrupted, barely glancing at the documents she was trying to present. Are you saying you couldn't understand the parking signs? A slight murmur ran through the courtroom. Several observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Recognizing the judge's dismissive tone and underlying assumptions, Rachel's expression remained neutral, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Actually, Your Honor, she began again, I was there on official business. Here is a letter from my employer stating. Montgomery cut her off again, his patience wearing thin. Miss Anderson, this court sees dozens of these cases every week. Everyone has an excuse. Everyone was just running in for a minute or didn't see the sign. The fact is, you parked illegally in a restricted zone. Rachel stood quietly, watching as the judge shuffled through his papers without really looking at her evidence. She noticed a young law clerk in the corner of the courtroom taking notes, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. Furthermore, Montgomery continued, given the length of time your vehicle was parked there, I'm going to increase the fine to $400 to ensure the message is properly received. Perhaps that will help you pay more attention to parking restrictions in the future. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the usual whispers and shuffling had ceased. The bailiff, who had worked with Judge Montgomery for years, was watching the scene with growing unease. Rachel took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. Your Honor, if you would just look at my documentation. Miss Anderson, Montgomery's voice grew sharp. This is not a debate. The fine is $400, due within 30 days. If you cannot pay the full amount, you can speak with the clerk about a payment plan. He reached for his gavel, ready to move on to the next case. Actually, Your Honor, Rachel spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. I believe you'll find this documentation quite relevant. You see, Miss Anderson, Montgomery's voice rose. I've made my ruling. Unless you want to be held in contempt of court, I suggest you accept the fine and move along. We have other cases to handle today. Rachel didn't move. Instead, she calmly placed her business card on the evidence table. The young clerk leaned forward to get a better look, and her eyes widened. The bailiff, curious about the unusual tension in the room, stepped closer to read the card. No one in the courtroom, least of all Judge Montgomery, was prepared for what Rachel Anderson was about to say next. The routine traffic court session was about to become anything but routine, and Judge Montgomery's comfortable world was moments away from being turned upside down. The young clerk's gasp was barely audible, but it caught the attention of several people in the courtroom. Judge Montgomery, however, remained focused on asserting his authority, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere around him. Your Honor, Rachel began again, her voice steady despite the clear dismissal she faced. As my documentation shows. Miss Anderson, Montgomery's voice crackled with irritation. He tapped his gavel sharply against the wooden block. This court has already been more than patient with you. The fine stands at $400, and I'm adding a $50 court fee for wasting valuable time. Rachel stood perfectly still, her brown eyes fixed on the judge. She hadn't moved to collect her business card from the evidence table. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Rachel Anderson stood her ground. Judge Montgomery, determined to maintain his authority, failed to notice the shifting dynamics around him. The courtroom had never been this quiet, as everyone sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Your Honor, Rachel said firmly, her voice resonating with a calm authority. As my documentation shows, I was parked in that space legally. Here is a letter from my employer, the State Attorney General's office, confirming that I was there on official business. She pointed to the business card on the evidence table. The young law clerk, now visibly intrigued, took a closer look and nodded slightly to herself. The bailiff, too, leaned in to read the card, his eyebrows raising in surprise. Judge Montgomery, still unwilling to back down, picked up the card with a huff. His eyes quickly scanned the information before him, and he felt a sudden jolt of recognition. Rachel Anderson was not just any defendant, she was an assistant attorney general. Realizing the gravity of his oversight, Judge Montgomery cleared his throat. Miss Anderson, I see here that you are indeed employed by the State Attorney General's office, he said, his tone shifting slightly, though his pride prevented him from fully conceding his error. However, the fact remains that your vehicle was parked in a restricted zone. Rachel's expression remained calm but determined. Your Honor, As the letter states, I was attending a meeting at the state office building, which falls under the official business category. The parking regulations allow for exceptions in such cases, which is why I am contesting this fine. Montgomery's grip on the gavel tightened. He prided himself on his efficiency and fairness, but this case was starting to unravel the neat facade he had built over the years. The courtroom watched in silence, waiting for his next move. Miss Anderson, I will review this documentation further, he said, trying to maintain his composure. Court is adjourned for a brief recess. We will reconvene in 15 minutes. As he rose from his seat, Montgomery could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. He retreated to his chambers, the door closing behind him with a soft click. For the first time in years, he felt his confidence waver. In his chambers, Montgomery sat at his desk, staring at the letter from the Attorney General's office. He had always prided himself on his ability to make quick, fair decisions, but this case was different. It wasn't just about a parking violation, it was about his own biases and the integrity of his courtroom. Rachel Anderson remained seated in the courtroom, her calm demeanor unwavering. She had faced tough situations before and knew how to handle pressure. Her background as a lawyer had prepared her for moments like this. As the 15-minute recess drew to a close, Montgomery took a deep breath and straightened his robe. He knew that his next actions would be scrutinized closely. When he re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Miss Anderson, he began, his voice measured. After reviewing the documentation provided, it is clear that you were on official business at the time of the parking violation. Therefore, I am dismissing the fine and any associated court fees. I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Rachel nodded respectfully, her expression remaining composed. Thank you, Your Honor, she said simply. As she gathered her documents and left the courtroom, Montgomery watched her go with a newfound sense of respect. The incident had shaken him, forcing him to confront the biases that had quietly influenced his judgments for years. He realized that being a good judge wasn't just about efficiency and upholding the law, it was also about fairness and self-awareness. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Montgomery couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. He knew that he needed to reevaluate how he approached his cases and ensure that justice was truly being served in his courtroom. Later that evening, as he sat with Eleanor at the dinner table, he recounted the events of the day. I had an interesting case today, he began, an assistant attorney general contesting a parking fine. It made me realize how important it is to look beyond the surface and truly understand each case. Eleanor listened intently, sensing the gravity of the situation. It sounds like it was a challenging day, she said gently, but it's good to see you reflecting on it. Montgomery nodded, feeling a sense of resolve. It was a wake-up call. I need to ensure that my judgments are fair and unbiased. It's not just about the law, it's about justice. As the evening drew to a close, Montgomery felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to be the kind of judge who upheld the principles of fairness and integrity. The days that followed were marked by a noticeable change in Judge Harold Montgomery's demeanor. The case with Rachel Anderson had left a profound impact on him, and he was determined to ensure that his courtroom reflected true fairness and justice. Each morning, as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, he reminded himself of the promise he had made to be more mindful and equitable in his decisions. Montgomery began to pay closer attention to each case, looking beyond the surface details to understand the context and circumstances of every defendant. His colleagues noticed the shift, though they didn't comment on it directly. They saw how he listened more intently, how he weighed each piece of evidence with greater care, and how he no longer rushed through cases with the same mechanical efficiency. One day, a case came before him that tested his resolve. A young man named Carlos Martinez stood nervously at the defendant's table. He was charged with reckless driving, a serious offense that could have significant repercussions for his future. Carlos Martinez, you are charged with reckless driving, Montgomery began, looking up from the file to meet the young man's eyes. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Carlos replied, his voice shaking slightly. Montgomery leaned forward, his expression softening. Tell me your side of the story, Mr. Martinez. Carlos took a deep breath and began to explain. He had been driving home late at night after a long shift at the restaurant where he worked. Exhausted, he had momentarily lost control of the vehicle. There were no injuries, but the incident had left him shaken. Your Honor, I know it was a mistake, Carlos said, his voice filled with regret. I've never been in trouble before, and I was just trying to get home. Please, give me a chance to prove that I'm a responsible person. Montgomery considered the young man's words carefully. In the past, he might have handed down a swift judgment, but now he took the time to weigh the circumstances. He asked for additional information about Carlos's background and reviewed letters of recommendation from his employer and community members. After a thoughtful pause, Montgomery made his decision. Mr. Martinez, I am placing you on probation. You will need to attend a safe driving course and complete community service. This will be your opportunity to demonstrate that you are indeed a responsible individual. Carlos's face lit up with relief and gratitude. Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down. As the young man left the courtroom, Montgomery felt a sense of satisfaction. He had upheld the law while also giving Carlos a chance to learn from his mistake and move forward positively. That evening, Montgomery shared the experience with Eleanor. It's not just about the law, Eleanor. It's about understanding the people behind the cases. Today, I gave a young man a second chance. It felt right. Eleanor smiled warmly. I'm proud of you, Harold. You're making a real difference. Montgomery's transformation did not go unnoticed by the broader community. Stories of his fair and thoughtful judgments began to circulate, earning him respect and admiration from both colleagues and citizens. People started to see him not just as a strict and efficient judge but as a compassionate and just individual who genuinely cared about the well-being of others. One morning, as Montgomery entered the courtroom, he found a letter on his desk. It was from Rachel Anderson. Dear Judge Montgomery, I wanted to thank you for how you handled my case. Your willingness to review the documentation and ultimately dismiss the fine meant a lot to me. It was a reminder of the importance of fairness and the impact that a single decision can have. Your actions inspired me, and I have been sharing this story with my colleagues as an example of how justice should be served. Thank you for being a judge who stands for what is right. Sincerely, Rachel Anderson. Montgomery felt a surge of gratitude as he read the letter. It was a validation of the changes he had made and a reminder of the positive ripple effects that fairness and integrity could create. Months passed, and Montgomery continued to approach his role with renewed purpose and dedication. He initiated several reforms within the courthouse to address unconscious biases and ensure that all defendants received fair treatment. He also began mentoring younger judges, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to embrace a more compassionate approach to justice. One day, as he was leaving the courthouse, he saw Carlos Martinez standing by the steps. The young man walked up to him with a broad smile. Judge Montgomery, I just wanted to thank you again. I've completed my community service and the safe driving course. I'm also starting a new job next week, Carlos said, his voice filled with pride. Montgomery smiled warmly. I'm glad to hear that, Carlos. You've done well. Keep up the good work, and remember that it's never too late to make positive changes. As Carlos walked away, Montgomery felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come a long way from the rigid, efficiency-driven judge he once was. He had learned that true justice required empathy, understanding, and a willingness to see the humanity in everyone. Judge Harold Montgomery's journey was a testament to the power of reflection and growth. His courtroom had become a place where justice was not just a mechanical process but a deeply human one, and as he continued to serve, he remained committed to upholding the principles of fairness and integrity that he had rediscovered. Eleanor often reminded him of the impact he was making. Harold, you're not just a judge. You're a beacon of hope for many people. Your actions inspire others to believe in the justice system again. Montgomery knew that his work was far from over, but he embraced each day with a renewed sense of purpose. He was grateful for the opportunity to make a difference and to be a force for good in the world. And so, the story of Judge Harold Montgomery became one of transformation, resilience, and the enduring power of justice served with compassion. I hope you enjoyed the conclusion of the story. If you need any further adjustments or have additional requests, feel free to let me know.